Welcome to the Daily Boogie.
As per Jared's request, it is time for
The Weekly Stelter.
Let's go, Weekly Stelter.
Robert Mueller's probe seems to be broadening in various countries and at the same time tightening in on members of President Trump's family. But the more Mueller discovers, the more Trump's TV boosters have to deny. The worse things look for Trump's inner circle, the worse the deflections get. For example, look at this new CNN poll. It finds that 61% of Americans believe the Russian investigation is a serious matter.
People who watched one of the videos last week, the CNN polls are back, ladies and gentlemen. According to this CNN poll, 61% of people believe the Russia investigation is a serious matter, according to the CNN poll. Windsor Live, thanks for joining us. Always a pleasure.
But if you're watching Fox, you're hearing the opposite.
Oh. It's funny. It's like, if you're watching Fox, you're hearing the opposite from the CNN poll. And this is a revelation. If you were watching Fox right now, you would be thinking the opposite of the CNN poll. So it's like, okay, CNN, so who's more accurate here? You'd be seeing the opposite of the CNN poll because, remember, if you remember the scope last week, we discount polls that, don't match our criteria. He said that. Those other polls out there have him at 50%. We've got him at 35%. Those other polls don't even meet the standards that we have here at CNN. See, I love Brian Stelter because it's just shameless. I love it. I love him.
We've been hearing about Russia nonstop, literally nonstop, for more than a year.
Literally.
Almost no information has come out to justify the obsession. None has come out to justify the claim that there was collusion. And most Americans are no longer interested, if they ever were.
Do you see the banner he's using on screen there? Tucker's banner says, Americans don't care about Russian meddling. But again, the CNN poll shows that's just not true. This is a brand new poll.
Do you see the banner he used there, folks? Do you see the banner? It says Americans don't care about Russia meddling. But if you look at our CNN poll, that's just simply not true. Carry on, Brian.
Data, it shows that 72% of Americans are very or at least somewhat concerned about foreign interference in U.S. elections. 70% are concerned specifically about Russian-backed disinformation campaigns, the kind of campaigns that are still going on today.
The kind of campaigns that CNN themselves spent a 5-hour live stream covering. Again, one of the videos on the Common Discourse on YouTube. I believe it was the MSNBC announcer, but CNN was covering it as well. And she said, this is the most organized protest rally that New York has ever seen. Jay Buck, thanks for joining us. Yep, those Russian-backed campaigns. Carry on, Brian.
Fox claims nobody cares.
Nobody cares.
Everybody wants this story to move on, except for the people who don't want it to move on. It's the election losers. But now, this is their Benghazi, right? This is their thing. It's paper thin, but they're...
Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't a bevy of current and former Democrats come out recently on the record and say how the Russia investigation thing is hurting their prospects long term? Just putting that out there. Carry on, Brian.
clutching on it hard.
I think that's fascinating. Paper
Fascinating.
thin? Again, only if you're not looking at the paper. The paper is piling up, Greg, in the form of indictments and subpoenas. This is just an incomplete list of what's happened so far. Every day there's news stories about what Mueller is finding, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, maybe that's why Sean Hannity has fallen back to this.
Back to Hannity.
Now remember, this whole witch hunt was supposed to only be about Trump-Russia collusion. That evidence does not exist all of this time.
Someone please, so Sean, the
Mr. Shadley, thanks for joining us. Go back to the start, Mr. Shadley, if you get a chance, in the replay stage, talking about blocking and memetics. It's a subject close to your heart, I know. What a great pause that is. That is like Brian Stelter doing The Thinker, you know, that classic pose, but that's his version of it. He was talking about the banner before under Tucker Carlson's show, which was most Americans don't care about the Russia probe. Here is Brian Stelter with his own one, pro-Trump media in denial about Mueller. In denial. Okay, so we'll get to that in this very show. Within this very clip, we will address the denial about Robert Mueller. It seems fantastical, but it's not.
original letter from the Attorney General's office appointing Mueller as special counsel. It doesn't say the word collusion, but it says Mueller is charged with investigating any links and or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of President Donald Trump. And, this is key, any matters that arose or may arise directly from the investigation.
Fascinating.
So this is an important story, these ongoing developments. And Mueller is certainly hard at work. There's a lot we don't know about what he's finding. But just in the past...
we've discussed this before, the concept of, I believe Americans call it the telephone game. We call it Chinese whispers. So you get a circle of kids, and the first kid gets a sentence, and he has to repeat the sentence to the next kid, and then she has to repeat the sentence, and so on and so forth. And then when it gets back to the original person, you adjudge how far off the original sentence it was. Do you guys remember that game? I think it's called the telephone game in America, but I may be showing my cultural ignorance here. So, there is this kind of concept. It exists in mass media, and I believe Andrew Breitbart spoke about it before. He called it the liberal media complex. So here we've got CNN, because he's like, look at all these headlines. Everybody agrees about the Mueller probe. CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, NBC News. So CNN puts up a headline, has a discussion. The Washington Post writes an article about the CNN discussion. The New York Times writes an article about the Washington Post, which was talking about CNN. NBC does an expose panel show on what the New York Times wrote, on what the Washington Post wrote, about what CNN talked about. And on it goes. And then when you get to the end of it, you're like, see? Everybody agrees. And it's been through all kinds of manipulation from one source to the next. And what's spat out at the other end is like not even close to what the actual story was. But carry on, Brian.
Few days. Take a look at all these new headlines.
All of them.
These stories about what Mueller is asking.
Look at all of these new headlines, one of which I'm actually represented by. Look at all of these new headlines. Look at CNN saying what CNN is saying right now here on CNN.
In these meetings with the various people he's interviewing, what he might be finding. There's a news story in the New York Times this morning about these developments. These developments come on a daily basis.
I can't believe he could only find 4. He's saying, everybody's saying it. Look at all of these headlines, and there's 3 if you discount the channel that he's actually on right fucking now. Look at all of these headlines. If someone said to you, just say you go to a farm, okay? And on the way to the farm, the farmer is saying to you, I have the absolute truth about farming. Nobody understands cows like I understand cows. And you're like, oh, okay, that sounds good. And you're like, mate, I have seen so many cows. I understand the cows. I know the truth about cows. And I'll prove it when we get to my farm. And you're like, okay, sounds good. So you jump out of the car and you walk up to the fence, and there's 3 cows in a field. And the farmer dressed in a cow suit. And he goes, look at all of these cows. would you be convinced? Oh, that's up to you.
So let's talk about it with two experts in this subject matter. Natasha Bertrand works for The Atlantic. She's covering national security, covering these investigations. And Steve Brill is the founder of Court TV, the founder of The American Lawyer. And he has a new venture we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. Natasha, first to you on the developments this week. I saw a lot of headlines about Mueller asking various questions to various...
I saw a lot of cows in that field. 3 to be exact.
...individuals. Did we actually learn anything new about the probe?
Where do we even begin? So we learned a lot this week about the scope of Mueller's investigation and how
what
it's
did we learn,
actually
Natasha?
expanding, even as many of Trump's defenders say that it's just a witch hunt and that nothing has been found. So we learned that Mueller is now investigating whether Jared Kushner's policies that he pushed in the White House were linked to any of his financial interests that he had before, of course, he entered the administration.
Okay. So what did we learn about the Mueller probe? Remember, people are in denial about the Mueller probe because there's so much truth coming out in the headlines, all of these headlines, all 3 of them. What did we learn about the Mueller probe, Natasha? Please reiterate.
Even as many of Trump's defenders say that it's just a witch hunt and that nothing has been found. So we learned that Mueller is now investigating whether Jared Kushner's policies that he pushed in the White House were linked to any of his financial interests that he had before, of course, he entered the administration.
Okay. So that's one thing we learned, ladies and gentlemen, is that Mueller is investigating X. Okay, that's not necessarily a discovery of any consequence. Because people investigate all sorts of things, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily true. It's wise to investigate. But learning that there is indeed investigation going on during an investigation is not necessarily a revelation I would put to you, dear listener. Let's carry on. What else have we learned from the Mueller investigation?
Also learned that Mueller is examining whether or not Trump himself knew about the hacked Democratic emails or about whether or not they were going to be released before they were actually released to the public by...
Okay, so let's play it again one more time for Natasha. So what else have we learned about the investigation?
Emails or about whether or not they were going... Whether or not Trump himself knew, investigating whether Jared Kushner's policies that he pushed in the White House were linked to any of his financial interests that he had before, of course, he entered the administration. We also learned that Mueller is examining whether or not Trump himself knew about the hacked Democratic emails or about whether or not they were...
So far we've learnt that Robert Mueller has learnt... Oh, no, sorry. Pardon me. Pardon my French. How silly of me. So far, we've learnt that Robert Mueller is asking questions about X and investigating Y. Yep. I mean, this is groundbreaking stuff.
Going to be released before they were actually released to the public by WikiLeaks, whether or not that former campaign aide,
Yes,
George Papadopoulos, ever told anyone in the Trump campaign that he had been told by someone linked to Russia that they had dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of thousands of emails. So now this actually goes back to the collusion question. Everyone thought that perhaps Mueller was just homing in.
Do you remember Brian in the beginning of this very conversation saying, no, collusion's not mentioned in the... in the original document, there is, collusion is not mentioned at all in the document. And she's like, this goes back to the collusion question. And cut to Brian Stelter at the start of the clip. They're all talking about collusion. Collusion's got nothing to do with it. And the lovely young lady Natasha says, this goes right back to collusion. Brian Stelter, ladies and gentlemen. He knows how to pick 'em.
On the obstruction of justice question because it was easier. But that, of course, was the public-facing aspect of his investigation. Now we know, based on the reporting from last week, that he actually still is pursuing very aggressively the collusion, the question of whether or not the Trump campaign knew about the dirt on Hillary Clinton.
So YouTube has really destroyed these people. This is a technique where you just ramble, you just spit out information and you hope that nobody's paying attention to like the details of what you're saying. So at the start of the show, Brian Stelter says that the pro-Trump media is in denial about the Mueller investigation. There is so much information coming out about the Mueller investigation. Like, look at all of these headlines. tell us about the Mueller investigation, Natasha. What have we learned? And she's like, well, we learned that Robert Mueller is now asking questions about X. We've also learned that Robert Mueller is now also asking questions about Y. And Brian Stelter's like, you know, those pro-Trump people say that this is all about collusion, but that's ridiculous. Look at the original document. Natasha, what do you think? And she's like, this goes right back to the collusion question. I mean, if man evolves into goldfish, this will be the moment. This will be the time when we all stand up and go, that was it. That was it. That's when it happened. Man became a goldfish at that very moment.
And whether or not that famous line from Donald Trump during that press conference, Russia, if you're listening, find those 30,000 missing emails, actually was tied back to his knowledge or not.
So when you see someone like Greg Gutfeld saying it's a paper-thin case, how do you react?
How do you react when someone like Greg Gutfeld says it's a paper-thin case? How do you react once we have told the public, we've told the world all of the stuff that we know about the Mueller investigation, and what we know, quote unquote, is defined as questions he may be asking? Look at all of this evidence here. How do you react to that?
It's astonishing that they're still saying that even after 19 people have been charged with crimes after...
Yes, that's true. Okay, we've got to give credit where it's due. Natasha is right. Monica says, I block them. How does one feel, says Chuck. Now that's a perfect pause. No, she's right there. 19 people have been charged with crimes. Well, not necessarily. They've been indicted. It's a bit different, but that's perhaps semantics. A great deal of those 19 were, as far as I can ascertain, Russians who ran a catering company who owned social media accounts. Russians who also organized the most organized New York City protest of all time, as we learnt last week. But carry on, Brian.
5 of them have pleaded guilty. I mean, it's very clear as of right now anyway that this is not just a witch hunt. And actually, Robert Mueller made that clear a few weeks ago when he indicted 13 Russian nationals for their role in interfering in the election. That made it clear to everyone around Robert Mueller, even his critics, that he was not just going after the president. He was actually actively investigating Russia's election interference.
God.
Where do the leaks come from? Because all those headlines I was showing, they're based
Can we take a break, Natasha?
on leaks. Is it Mueller's team? Do you have any reason to believe his office is leaking?
There's no
Oh, this is fantastic. Wait to hear this.
reason to believe that it's Mueller's office. If Mueller's office was leaking, then we would not be completely surprised and shocked every time he dropped an indictment.
A new indictment.
Exactly. Yeah. We would have known beforehand, for example, that he was going to charge Michael Flynn with pleading guilty. We would have with lying to the FBI, which he then...
If someone was leaking, we absolutely would be leaking to CNN. And if someone was leaking from Robert Mueller's team, you can be absolutely sure that we would know about each indictment before it happens. That's how we know leaking doesn't happen, because we didn't know what was going to happen. Yes, Natasha. Yes. Staff writer at The Atlantic. The staff writer at The Atlantic, ladies and gentlemen, hasn't got any phone calls about perhaps sensitive information. Therefore, guess what? There is no leaking. See, I think most sane people understand leaking doesn't literally happen like in the movies where you pick up the phone to the staff writer at The Atlantic and say, okay, here's what I know. Please print that in the paper. No, it doesn't work that way. You tell someone, they tell someone. Makes me dizzy, says Hubba Hubba. No, carry on, Brian.
Pled guilty for. We would have known that George Papadopoulos, this virtually unknown campaign aide, had pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI and was now a cooperating witness. So the leaks are primarily coming from people who have already been interviewed by Robert Mueller and who are telling the press what questions were asked so that we can all get a better idea of what the scope of his investigation is.
Okay, so what we know about the investigation is what questions are being asked in the investigation. Bravo, CNN. Thank you for illuminating. Thank you for spreading sunshine in an otherwise dark world. Now we are all fully aware of all of the revelations, all three of them, and one guy dressed in a cow suit, of all of the truth, and everybody who denies that questions are being asked during an investigation, mind you. All of those people are living in denial. He even played the clips. Look, he even played clips. Watch this. What does Tucker Carlson actually say?
Again, the CNN poll shows that's just not true.
None has come out to justify the claim that there was collusion, and most Americans, literally nonstop for more than a year, almost no information has come out to justify the obsession. None has come out to justify the claim that there was collusion.
Okay, none has come out to justify the claim that there was collusion. They're in denial. They're in denial. Natasha, tell us about all the truth that we know about the investigation.
That it's just a witch hunt and that nothing has been found. So we learned that Mueller is now investigating whether Jared Kushner's policies that he pushed in the White House were linked to any of his financial interests that he had before.
We learned that the guy doing an investigation is still asking questions. He knows so much that all we can tell you is that he asked somebody this. He asked somebody a question during an investigation. Carry on, Brian.
Little we actually know about Mueller's probe. If we're only finding out what
people who have already been interviewed by Robert Mueller and
now, are you ready for this? Are you ready for this? Remember the start.
Who are telling the press what questions were asked so that we can all get a better idea of.
You are about to see peak Stelter, ladies and gentlemen. This is why I love watching Brian Stelter. Wait till you see this.
What the scope of his investigation is.
So I'm reminded again, Steve, how little we actually know about Mueller's probe. If we're only finding out.
Yes! Look at that face. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Stelter just got up and danced. He freaking danced. So after inviting my guest on to disprove all of those Fox News people about how they're in denial. After I brought on this person to disprove all of those people, because we know so much about the investigation, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, look at all of these headlines, all three of them. Look at them. Look at them. If you look at all of these headlines, you'll understand that we know so much about the Mueller investigation. Tell us, Natasha. Well, we know this, we know that, we know that. Brilliant. Turns to guest number 2. You know what? This highlights to me exactly how little we know about the investigation. What? What planet am I on? What is going on here? This is an absolute circus. This is an absolute circus. We know so much about the Mueller investigation, everyone else is in denial. Natasha, what do we know? We know the investigator asked this. Brilliant. Well, this proves that we really don't know anything about the Mueller investigation. Comment?
A better idea of what the scope of his investigation is.
So I'm reminded again, Steve, how little we actually know about Mueller's probe. If we're only finding out what questions are being asked inside these meetings.
We're only finding out what questions are being asked inside these meetings. Yes, Brian. Congratulations. Congratulations, Brian. You identified about 4 minutes of, like, the equivalent of dead air. That's why you're a pro, my man.
Papadopoulos, this virtually unknown campaign aide, had pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI and was now...
What an insult. Can you imagine being Natasha, being invited onto this show and being asked, can you please tell us what you know? And she's like, okay, here's what I know. I know this, 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 and this. And then he turns around to the next guest and says, well, this shows that we really don't know anything. It's like, thanks, Brian, you prick. Wow.
Cooperating witness. So the leaks are primarily coming from people who have already been interviewed by Robert Mueller and who are telling the press what questions were asked so that we can all get a better idea of what the scope of his investigation is.
So I'm reminded again, Steve, how little we actually know about Mueller's probe. If we're only finding out what questions are being asked inside these meetings, we don't know the answers, and we don't know what Mueller already knows.
Well, that's the problem.
We don't know what Mueller already knows. Yes, you know even less than that.
President Trump's defenders in the media have,
which
is they can't. It's not a two-sided debate because unlike the Ken Starr investigation,
I love this. He's like, you know, the problem with the pro-Trump media is it's not a two-sided debate. And I'm like, yes, because you're putting up such a good argument. How could anybody deny it? Except for the fucking host on the fucking show that the guest was invited on to talk to. Who could deny it except the fucking host? Carry on, Brian.
of President Clinton, where he was holding press conferences, constantly leaking. You know, he literally held press conferences outside his office.
We can show the video, I think,
months.
once at his driveway or something.
We can show the video.
Reporters who were covering the Mueller investigation
God, please show the
literally
video.
didn't know where his office was, and many don't. So the problem that the president...
Okay, we've figured it out, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. The reason that they were in denial is because some people got the wrong address on Mueller's office.
literally didn't know where his office was, and many don't. So the problem that the president's defenders have is they have nothing to argue against, and every time Mueller does something, it comes as a complete surprise.
I agree with him. They do have nothing to argue against because all you can do is come on and say how little you know and what questions might be being asked, again, quote unquote, in an investigation. That's generally what happens in investigations. People ask questions. I know it sounds like some kind of revelation. I know it sounds like a way out, far off idea. But in investigations, people ask questions. So if your reliable source is someone who's getting told what questions are being asked, when they themselves are being asked, how much do you know? Then, you know, I can understand why people are saying that we have nothing to argue against. I love it. This guy says those people have nothing to argue against, and the other people are like, yeah, I know. I know, bro. That's the fucking problem. You've got nothing to argue against. That's your fault. You haven't given us anything to argue against yet. The problem for the pro-Trump people is that they have nothing to argue against. Yes! That's your problem. You haven't given them anything. I just can't even. I just can't even.
They have nothing to argue against, and every time Mueller does something, it comes as a complete surprise, which gives it much more drama,
more
because
power.
Nothing has been leaked. It's a total surprise.
These are some pictures of Ken Starr back in the day. Let's show that famous cover of your old magazine, Steve. Brill's
It's like we're going back to Ken Starr. It's like we know the Mueller investigation is on track. We're going back to Monica.
This is a cover of...
Not Monica in the Periscope, the other one.
Ken Starr, surrounded by reporters, and the title there is Pressgate. And you had some critiques of the press really back then that Ken Starr was driving the coverage of the Starr inquiry. It sounds like it's very different this time.
Yeah, now, the fact is, that every reporter worth his salt, me included, when I used to write about, the Teamsters Union and organized crime, loves to get leaks, especially leaks of grand jury proceedings.
Right.
It is illegal for prosecutors to leak that. So reporters love to try to get it, but you have to, with any perspective, admire a guy like Mueller, who you wouldn't dream of asking him or his staff to leak that stuff because they don't.
We wouldn't dream of doing our job in the media. No, not here at CNN. Here at CNN, we know nothing, we tell you nothing, everyone else is in denial, and then we agree with you. And then we'll say that you have nothing to argue against and make out like it's your fault. Because that's how a pro does it. Fantastic stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, that was...
The Weekly Stelter.